This video was brought to you by Ground News. Europe is staring into a leadership vacuum at the worst possible time. With a war on its doorstep, years of economic upheaval, and a global great power struggle, the EU seems to be without reliable leaders to deal with its many pressing challenges, with the continent instead a mosaic of fragile coalitions, unpopular politicians, and populist forces. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Europe's traditional leaders seem to have vacated the position, and who might replace them. Before we get into it, Europe's lack of leadership is a major topic in our upcoming magazine Too Long, where we have a long read on the issue. Find out more and pick up a copy by clicking the link in the description. Firstly then, what do we mean by leader of Europe? Essentially, we're talking about powerful national leaders with big strategic visions who steer the EU's direction and help lead it through times of crisis and upheaval. For decades, these leaders have come from either France or Germany. Now, for much of the latter part of the 20th century, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President François Mitterrand were the two most important European leaders. Both served for well over a decade and were instrumental in strengthening the European project. Kohl oversaw German reunification and helped to unify Europe by working with Mitterrand to bolster the Franco-German relationship and advance European integration with the single market and Maastricht Treaty. Mitterrand's successor, Jacques Chirac, took over in 1995 and continued in this leadership role, championing the European Union and pushing for the bloc's largest ever enlargement in 2004. Chirac was also Europe's leading voice in opposing the US's invasion of Iraq in 2003 and worked with British Prime Minister Tony Blair to set the groundwork for the EU's common security and defence policy. Then, in 2005, German Chancellor Angela Merkel came into the picture and would establish herself as Europe's de facto leader and an EU stalwart for over a decade and a half. Dubbed by some the Queen of Europe and Europe's crisis manager, Merkel memorably helped to steer the bloc through a number of major crises and turbulent times. The Eurozone crisis, migration crisis, and COVID-19, for example. Now, none of this is to say that these former leaders of Europe were flawless or universally liked. Chirac, for example, suffered legislative defeats at home, and French voters rejected the European constitution that he had supported. Merkel, meanwhile, has seen her legacy judged pretty poorly, particularly for Germany's reliance on Russian energy. However, it's hard to argue against the fact that they were, in their times, political heavyweights and leaders of Europe. However, ever since Merkel stepped down in 2021, and with Europe facing a multitude of crises, the continent has appeared leaderless. Now, the two obvious figures who've arguably failed to fill this vacuum are Merkel's successor, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and French President Emmanuel Macron. Like many of his predecessors, Macron has never been afraid to position himself as Europe's leader. He established himself as the preeminent big-picture thinker in the EU, consistently advocating for so-called European strategic autonomy, which seeks to enhance the EU's ability to independently pursue its own interests by A, reducing its dependence on the United States, and B, transforming the EU into a more active geopolitical agent. In 2017, Time magazine labelled him the next leader of Europe, with a slightly foreboding asterisk, if only he can lead France. However, 7 years later, and not a huge amount has changed. The EU is still reliant on the US for its security, as a report set out this year. Macron has also initiated various efforts to foster EU and wider European cooperation, such as setting up the European political community to integrate countries like Ukraine and the UK into European discussions. However, these initiatives have been criticised by some for being unproductive and little more than a talking shop. Most damaging to Macron's potential European leadership, though, were disastrous performances by his alliance at both the European election and the French snap legislative election this summer, massively crippling his domestic power and undermining his international clout. Also, France under Macron has fallen foul of the EU's fiscal rules, forcing its government to preoccupy itself with slimming down its own budget. But it's not just him. Olaf Scholz has also failed to take the mantle of leader of Europe. Germany's sluggish economy is on track to shrink for the second consecutive year, and the German export engine has been damaged by the loss of cheap Russian fossil fuels and a decline in Chinese demand for German products. On various issues, Scholz has been behind or out of step with the rest of the continent too, rather than leading it. Germany was one of only 5 EU members to reject tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and it took a lot of pressure to prompt Scholz's Germany into making long drawn-out U-turns on things like sending tanks to Ukraine. To make matters worse, Scholz's coalition is polling terribly and has been plagued by infighting, leaving it reportedly on the verge of collapse, undermining Scholz's standing and forcing him to retreat from the European front lines back towards domestic politics. So, if there is a European leadership vacuum, who might fill it? One potential option is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Despite fears that as the leader of a far-right party, she might undermine Italy's place in Europe, Meloni's instead emerged as a significant EU power broker. She's transformed the EU's approach to asylum, becoming a driving force behind bilateral migration deals, and playing a pivotal role in securing the EU's new asylum pact. Meloni has also established herself as something of a bridge between mainstream centre-right and radical right parties, although her previously budding relationship with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has since soured. Another contender is Spain's Socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. As leader of what is set to become the world's fastest growing major advanced economy, Sanchez has specifically stated that he wants to elevate Spain from its traditional peripheral role into a leadership one. As a member of the same European Socialist Party as Scholz, Sanchez has also done a far better job of rallying Europe's left, especially when it comes to defending immigration. And earlier this year, he toured Europe to advocate for the recognition of Palestine, with Spain, Norway, Ireland, and Slovenia all doing so this year. Elsewhere, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who, after his 5-year tenure as President of the European Council, returned to the Polish premiership last year, and he certainly has name recognition, plus plenty of EU experience to take him to a leadership role. He has also sought to lead the EU's support for Ukraine, as well as rebuilding the Weimar Triangle with Paris and Berlin. Our final possible contender is the current German opposition leader of the Christian Democratic Union, Friedrich Merz, who will likely become Germany's next Chancellor after their parliamentary elections. Squeezed out of top-level politics by his arch-party rival Angela Merkel more than 2 decades ago, Merz has returned to the head of the CDU and is enjoying nearly twice the level of popularity as Scholz. But whether he can reclaim Germany's leadership role remains to be seen. Ultimately, it's no easy task for any potential contender. They'll have to navigate the increasingly polarized political environment and work with, but not be outshone by, a European Commission that's in the driver's seat in Brussels. Who leads the EU is obviously important though, with the EU facing a number of challenges, many of which are outside of their control. In fact, Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister and the current holder of the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, said that depending on the results of the US election, the EU might need to fundamentally change their approach to Russia, with 48 different news outlets reporting on this story alone. Now, 36% of that reporting came from the left, while 43% came from the right. And if you compare the headlines, you start to see some interesting framing emerge. On the left, you have the Kyiv Independent saying that if Trump wins the US presidential election, Europe cannot remain pro-war. While on the right, you have Arrigo simply saying, Viktor Orban, come on Donald Trump. These stories are similar. The framing, well, that's very different. Now, all of this analysis is possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organize them by story, with each story coming with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean right, you probably missed this story where Russia denied, quote, baseless claims about their election interference in the US. Ground News is such an incredibly useful platform that captures information you just can't get anywhere else. It's especially useful when you're looking at news stories from around the world, as I'm sure our very global audience often does. If you're not familiar with the media market, it's hard to know who you should trust. So Ground's guidance can prove invaluable whether you're a European trying to unpack the US election or an American trying to understand the Bulgarian one. Okay, the latter does sound less likely. Best of all, Ground are currently offering our viewers a 50% discount on their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to their election pages, blind spot feed, and many other features that empower you as a news consumer. This is their biggest discount yet, so go to ground.news/TLDR, scan the QR code on screen, or use the link in the video's description to subscribe today.